Yesterday, U.S. President Donald Trump threatened Canada with, quote, severe fertilizer tariffs. That had some in the industry scratching their heads because he's been reducing these levies on fertilizer imports from this country. Now, if he reverses course, and we don't know if he will, it would make U.S. farmers pay more for these crop nutrients. It could, though, arguably hurt the Canadian fertilizer sector. Let's get more on the global picture in potash. We're joined by Matt Simpson, CEO of Brazil Potash. Matt, great to talk to you, and thanks very much indeed. Tell us about Brazil Potash, because you are working on what could be a gigantic mine in Brazil. You could be looking at about 2.4 million tons of potash production annually.
Yeah, that's correct. Brazil is the world's largest importer of potash. They're about 22% of a roughly $20 billion a year market, growing at about 6.8% a year. And it's silly because they have potentially the second biggest potash basin in the world. So Brazil Potash is looking to build a new supply of potash in the backyard of the Brazilian farmer that will have a cost to mine, process, and deliver that will be less than just the transportation cost alone for everyone else.
We want to hear more about it because you've got some interesting people. You yourself were, you were very senior in Rio Tinto's iron ore company of Canada. You have Mayo Schmidt of Nutrien and Viterra fame as your executive chairman. So we want to hear more about the company. But just give us the picture here. America brings in something like 80% of its potash from this country. Scotia said yesterday, in the short term, they can't. There's no substitute for that.
Yeah, that's correct, Andrew. I mean, there's three countries, being Canada, Russia, and Belarus, that supply about 80% of the world's potash. Canada makes up about 40% of that. The U.S. is the third largest consumer in the world at about 12 million tons a year, but imports 95% of its needs. Over 80% of it comes from Canada. So if Trump were to put tariffs onto Canadian potash, it would inevitably result in prices being passed on to the farmers and ultimately everyday consumers in the grocery store, because there is no displacement. They'd really be looking to the Russians and the Belarusians to make up tonnage, who are largely committed to China and India.
And they are working on something, Michigan potash, but it sounds like it would be a bit more than 1 million tons, and it could take years before that thing is running.
That's correct. There is a little bit of domestic potash production in New Mexico right now. There's some deposits in Utah, but the biggest potential asset in the United States is the one you referenced in Michigan that does have good quality ore. But even there, when that project comes online, the U.S. would still be heavily reliant on Canadian imported material, especially given our inland rail connections between countries.
Yeah, of course. And this stuff, infrastructure, it's a bit like iron ore, I guess. Yeah, the trains, the giant trains and infrastructure. It's not like gold. You can put it in a helicopter. Before we get back to Brazil Potash, so that is a strategic vulnerability, I guess. Russia and its sidekick Belarus, a huge global supplier.
That's correct. I mean, globally, we're extremely exposed by having such a high concentration, especially when you consider Russia, Belarus, and if you want to throw in Israel, countries that are sanctioned or recently had wars, you have half the world's potash supply. And this is one of the three essential nutrients used to grow food. And you're spot on. It is a bulk commodity, and transportation is typically somewhere around 2.5 times the cost of mining and processing.
So how would you move the potash then that you produce to crucial markets? I guess domestically, how would you do it?
Well, we're quite fortunate because we're only 8 kilometers away from a major inland river system. So in our case, most of the farming in Brazil occurs in what's called Mato Grosso state. And Brazil is blessed because they have a year-round climate that allows them to grow 2.5 crops a year, whereas most other countries like Canada or the U.S. can only do one. It has amongst the highest amounts of fresh water in the world, but its exposure is that it imports over 95% of its potash. So today, farmers in Mato Grosso export a little over 8.5 million tons of soybean, cotton, corn to routes in the north. And there's a transshipment terminal only about 60 kilometers away from us where river barges are reloaded onto ocean-going vessels for export. And on the backhaul, there's only about 700,000 tons of transport. So instead of those barges and trucks going back empty to the farmers, we'll load them with potash.
Oh, that's interesting. What will your project cost roughly to build?
The total project cost will be about $2.5 billion to build, out of which we'll get about $1.8 billion in debt. We do have a royalty option that'll bring in about another $150 million. And then we're looking at what's called a build, own, operate, transfer for some of our infrastructure, which could cover about another 200 to 350 million. So we're really trying to make that equity investment as small as possible.
And would you see yourself selling it into the U.S. market, or I mean, it sounds like domestic demand would be plenty to account for your production?
We'll initially supply somewhere around 17% of Brazil's domestic need, but this basin in Brazil is absolutely massive. It has the potential to be about 2/3 the size of the basin in Saskatchewan. So over time, you could definitely ramp up production quite meaningfully. And our marketing estimates show that we can undercut all of Latin America and all the way up into the southern United States, such as Florida.
We'd better jump. Thank you. And just a reminder, of course, Matt Mayo Schmidt, well known in the fertilizer industry, is your executive chairman. So you signed up a big name there. Matt, thank you very much indeed.
Appreciate it.
Matt Simpson, CEO of Brazil Potash.